name is Castro. I'm a senior analyst here at the Innovation Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to our event today on the future of privacy online, which we are co-hosting with the Technology Policy Institute. So I encourage you, if you're coming in now, there's plenty of seats at the front. Keep on moving in after every food. What we're going to do today is go through the panel, have a little bit of a dialogue about online privacy. Each person will do about 5 minutes of local remarks, and then we'll get into a little bit of a conversation between the panelists, informal, and dig down into the issues a little more. And we'll save plenty of time at the end, so anyone here is welcome to comments, ask questions for the panel, and be part of the conversation. Before I introduce the panelists today, I want to make a few framing remarks. Privacy is obviously a hugely important issue today, and I think it's important is only increasing as more and more people are sharing personal data about themselves online, about who they are, about the things they like, even about where they are. And as people share information about themselves online, this raises a lot of questions. It raises questions about who's responsible for the data and what can be done with this data. And right now, I think the central policy question that we're trying to answer is, do consumers have enough control over their personal information? Or is there a need for government to step in? But as we try and come with solutions, I think it's important to put these questions into perspective. Much of the conversation right now is about how to give greater levels of privacy to consumers. But before we can say how much we want, we need to be able to know how much that's going to cost. And privacy does come at a cost. There are trade-offs for more privacy, and these kind of costs need to be considered when we start talking about what kind of regulations we want to have in place. I think right now, there's a lot of lack of understanding about what the trade-offs are. And part of the problem is that there's not a lot of data out there right now about the impact of privacy laws. But the data that is out there seems to overwhelmingly suggest that privacy laws can negatively impact consumers by leading to lower technology adoption and use. I think one of the best examples of this is a study that came out in 2008 from UVA and MIT. And it found that states that had adopted health data privacy laws had lower levels of adoption of electronic health records. And incidentally, they were also doing studies using professors. They were looking at electronic health records, and they were seeing that it reduces the infant mortality rates, which of course then suggests that privacy regulations not only have an impact on consumers and businesses, but have real life consequences. Much of the discussion today is about privacy legislation for data collected and used online. And a particular concern, I think, for a lot of people is targeted advertising and behavioral advertising. I think some of this concern comes out of misunderstanding about how the technology works. We saw a lot of these same objections, I think in the room 4 or 5 years back when Google released Gmail, and people were upset about Google is reading my email. And I think we need to be able to make distinctions between automated technology being used to provide ads and somebody's digging through email. We can see the same kind of distinction when we talk about targeted advertising. I think a lot of the concerns here are speculative. There's not a lot of evidence right now that shows consumers are being harmed when they're shown an ad that, for example, is more relevant to them than an ad that's not. But there is research out there actually suggesting that privacy regulations should be considered carefully because of the negative impact they can have on consumers and more broadly on the internet ecosystem. This year we did a study on the 25-year anniversary of when the first .com domain name was registered. We found that the internet is contributing about $1.5 trillion to the internet economy. Much of the internet, of course, including the top 5 websites, all use online advertising. So if we go back to the research, what did it say? There's obviously the study by Howard Gills that came out last year that looked at advertising rates and found that they were about 2.5 times higher for regular, for targeted ads over regular ads. And of course this matters because publishers are able to receive higher value and they can have targeted ads as leads to higher quality content and more content available to consumers. More recently there was a study that came out from the University of Toronto and MIT that was analyzing the impact of privacy regulations in Europe. And they found that after an EU directive limited the ability of advertisers to collect and use data was introduced, that the effectiveness of online advertising dropped by about 65%. And so if you think about that, that has serious economic implications. The authors estimated that if European advertisers dropped their spending in proportion to the drop in effectiveness, that total online advertising, of course, would drop by over half, or around $8 billion to $2.8 billion. The study also found that the impact of these privacy regulations were felt especially on general interest sites, which isn't surprising because if you're a general interest site to a niche site, you don't really know what the users are on a general interest site. So, for example, news sites are general interest sites. Everyone is concerned about what you find print media or newspapers in the country should be, probably news sites to find it. Again, what all this means, I think, is that you have to be considering the impact of privacy regulations on the internet ecosystem. Understand that more restrictive regulations do come at a greater cost. And that's not to say that something that doesn't need to be done. Certainly, policymakers should be considering consumer rights and making sure that we're protected. But a lot of this can be done using existing mechanisms or without substantial reform. For example, through more transparency in terms of service, stronger enforcement of contracts, and greater regulation of the industry. So I would argue that more broadly, the conversation about privacy that we have is fundamentally wrong. It's not that we need privacy legislation. We need data innovation legislation. The focus should be on innovation. We need policies and programs in place that encourage and facilitate the development of new, interesting, useful applications for consumers and businesses that can use data. And we need to be breaking down barriers to doing this. And part of this will be educating people so they understand what the value is of data in today's information economy. I'm hoping that's part of what we can do today. So let me go ahead and introduce different panelists. First, we'll be hearing from Tom Lenard, who's co-hosting this event today with us. Tom is the president and senior fellow of the Technology Policy Institute. Tom has authored a number of articles and books about issues relating to telecom, privacy, e-commerce, and other regulatory issues. Before joining the Technology Policy Institute, Tom was acting president of the Progress Freedom Foundation, and Tom has a PhD in economics from Brown University. We're also hearing from Danny Weitzner, who's the associate administrator for the Office of Policy Analysis and Development at NTIA. Prior to joining NTIA, Danny taught Internet Public Policy at MIT and was policy director of the World Wide Web Consortium's Technology and Society Committees. Danny was also co-founder and deputy director of the Center for Democracy and Technology and deputy policy director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He received an undergraduate degree from Swarthmore and a law degree from Buffalo Law School. We have Mark Eichorn is the Assistant Director of the FTC Bureau of Consumer Protection Division for Privacy and Identity Protection, or DPID. He previously served as the Attorney Advisor for FTC Chairman John Leibowitz on consumer protection issues. Mark graduated from Yale Law School. And we have Ken Spiramani, who's the Director of Public Policy at a little-known startup on Facebook. Tim's specialty is privacy and constitutional law. Before joining Facebook, Tim was a senior legislative counsel at the ACLU. And Tim did his undergraduate degree from Georgetown and a JD from the University of Michigan. And last we'll be hearing from Fernando, who's the Vice President of External Affairs and Policy Counselor at Time Warner. He also served as Director of Time Warner Cable's Research Program on Digital Communications, which helps do scholarship fields of interest in cable and telecom research. And he received his undergraduate degree from Harvard and law degree from Georgetown. I think we have 4 lawyers up here at economics and technologists, which is interesting. I'm going to turn it over to Tom, and I just asked if you could pass over your mic.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Could you turn up the mic?
And thanks to ITIF for co-hosting this with us and for most of the heavy lifting. Dan's introduction was really good. Leads right into what I want to say, which is really what we need to do is we need to kind of get back to basics with respect to privacy carefully and rigorously responsible report on board. There's nothing very radical about this. Really just sound regulatory policy practice. And in fact, over the past 30 to 40 years, through many administrations,
Will you speak up?
through many administrations of both parties.
Let's switch things out.
Yeah, come
So there's nothing very radical about doing cost-benefit analysis. It's really just good regulatory policy making practice, and it's become relatively routine over the past 30 or 40 years through many different administrations for analyzing major regulatory proposals. So just as we estimate the benefits and costs of clean air regulation, and in fact there's an executive order that requires it, we ought to do the same thing for privacy regulation. It's not to suggest that it's easy, but we really need a lot more information before we're going to be able to come to an informed judgment that regulation that limits either the collection or the use of information is going to be in the interest of consumers. And right now we're operating pretty much in an empirical vacuum. There are at least two major benefits to applying cost-benefit analysis in the privacy area. First is that it clarifies what we know and what we don't know about the subject. And despite the fact that we've been talking about this issue for more than a decade, and despite the fact that there is a fairly voluminous privacy literature, the discussion about privacy regulation is really relatively uninformed by actual data. And the second thing is that it makes, Nat was talking about this, it makes explicit what the trade-offs really are between the benefits of increased privacy and the benefits of increased information in the marketplace. And to those who would argue that there are no trade-offs, and there are people who do argue that, there's a simple way to show that it's true, which is to do a cost-benefit analysis. If the analysis is properly done and there are no trade-offs, i.e. you can do it costlessly, then that will come out of the analysis. So generally speaking, what does privacy regulation do? It reduces the amount of information available, and it may be warranted. It's a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition, if there is a market failure that results in too much information being available in the marketplace. So the benefits of privacy regulation are the reduction in costs to individuals associated with too much information. So that means we need to estimate, or really at a minimum, just identify the harms associated with having too much information available. And in fact, there really is no analysis, at least of which I'm aware, that shows any significant actual harms from too much information in the marketplace. Most of the talk is about hypothetical harms rather than actual harms. And a major reason why it's difficult to find evidence of actual harm is that much of the information on the web, at least the information that's used for commercial purposes, is used anonymously. So proponents of more regulation frequently argue that consumers don't understand how their information is being used. And perhaps the most important thing that they don't really understand, and they need to understand better, is that their information is generally used anonymously, which is not a very intuitive concept. To the extent that their information is known, it is known by computers rather than individuals. So kind of the bottom line about benefits is that if it's difficult to find harm associated with too much information, then also the benefits of privacy regulation are at best going to be small. Now moving to the cost side, the costs are the reduction in the benefits associated with ongoing information. So those benefits include targeted advertising. They include content supported by the revenues of targeted advertising producers. They include things like improved authentication, helping to prevent fraud, and other bad things. And we're starting, as Dan suggested, we're starting to get some empirical information about those things. Dan talked about the study by Avi Goldfarb from the University of Toronto and Catherine Tucker from MIT, which just appeared in a working paper form in this last August, where they studied the effect of the European privacy laws, and they showed that the European privacy laws reduced the effectiveness of online advertising by 65% relative to the rest of the world, where those laws did not go into place. So this means that the advertising is less useful to consumers and therefore less valuable to advertisers. Advertisers, as Dan indicated, pay less for less effective ads, which decreases the amount available to support online content, and particularly for more general websites such as newspapers, which obviously everybody's concerned about being able to develop a viable business model. Or alternatively, if they don't spend less, advertisers might just buy more untargeted ads, which is going to impose cost on the consumers that have to look at all those ads that they don't really want to see. Dan also mentioned the Howard Beale study, which is a kind of complementary study where he gathered data on advertising rates and showed that the rates for behaviorally targeted ads were about were more than twice as high as the rates for untargeted ads. Again, reflecting the greater value that consumers get from ads targeted to their interest, and reflecting the greater revenue available to support online content. So, and finally, just let me say a very brief word about social networking privacy practices, which clearly present somewhat different issues, because obviously the information is not anonymous. But if anybody is contemplating, regulation or guidelines or things like that, the same principles and practices ought to apply. Specifically, the benefits and costs of any proposal ought to be carefully assessed before moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. So my thanks to ITIN and to TPI for hosting this event and for inviting me. As many of you know, the Commerce Department is in the middle of the process of assessing our posture and priorities on online privacy issues. We're doing this, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our interim observations. I'll caution you that if you try to infer from these interim observations anything about what our report is going to finally say, you'll be, if anything, way ahead of me, because we still haven't decided everything our interim report is going to finally say. But I do want to offer some thoughts about where we are in the process. I'll just say by way of background that about a year ago at the Commerce Department, we began, Secretary Locke launched an Internet Policy Task Force. And in that task force, we focused on 4 key Internet policy issues that we think are important to advancing innovation and consumer welfare in the Internet environment. Those issues are online privacy, what we're going to talk about today, cybersecurity, online copyright, and the global free flow of information. That is, you can think of that as the Commerce Department's counterpart to the State Department's Internet Freedom Initiative, which looks at many of the same challenges and tries to bring to bear some of the trade disciplines that were involved into those same questions. But I'm going to talk about our privacy and innovation initiative. We began looking at the nexus between privacy and innovation really for 3 reasons. We're well aware that there's a relationship between the perception about the online privacy environment and the way that consumers function in the online environment. The nexus is not, the relationship is not always clear. I'm not sure it's quite as simple as Tom suggests. I'd say that we found data points pointing in often opposite directions, that consumers seem to worry increasingly about their privacy situation, and yet at the same time, obviously are making more and more intensive use of personal information for all kinds of innovative services. So that's I think just a baseline challenge that we have to struggle with. We're very aware, and we've heard from many of the innovators in the internet economy that there would be value in developing a clearer sense of more of what privacy obligations are, and streamlining the process for innovators of figuring out what they can and cannot do with personal information. The failure to do that imposes a cost. By the same token, obviously, pushing the needle too far in the other direction poses many other costs. And finally, I think that if there's one thing that's really changed in the online privacy environment since we as a country first addressed the issue of the mid-90s, that is when the web first emerged, I think that what we've all become quite aware of is the intensely global nature of the internet economy and the internet environment overall. That barriers that exist around the world in other countries to the free flow of information, whether it's for political purposes or for privacy protection purposes or anything else, really have a substantial impact on U.S. competitiveness and U.S. trade interests. So there's an increased urgency, I would say, in addressing this question. A bit about our process. We've had the opportunity to consult very widely with a number of different stakeholders on this issue. We put out a notice of inquiry in the spring. We learned a lot from the responses to that notice. We've had the chance to work very closely with our colleagues at the FTC over the last year. I'm sure Mark will talk about their process. That collaboration will be ongoing and continuing. And obviously, as you all know, we don't have anyone from the Hill here, but there's increased interest, obviously, on the Hill, and we're in active discussions there. I think that what I want to just do is highlight three of what we see as the challenges, and in some ways the paradoxes of the online privacy debate overall. First of all, I'd say just as I as a kind of a nervous tick, sometimes they'll say online privacy. It's not clear to me that's a real category anymore that distinguishes one privacy issue from another privacy issue. So we'll just stick to privacy, information privacy in general. And here's some of what we've learned, and these are all in comments that are publicly available on our website. We've learned on the one hand that I'll just go through these and then talk about it in more detail. The kind of challenge and paradox number one is that there seems to be growing support and growing call for some baseline privacy protection legislated in some manner, but no one is quite sure what that really would be. Efforts at proposing this have met with pretty mixed reactions. Secondly, we think that it's quite clear that the U.S. actually has a very robust privacy protection framework through our legal system, but it's not to say it couldn't be improved. But it's a strong and viable framework, and yet neither consumers nor many of our trading partners seem to accept that. Seem to believe that it actually is there. And then third, many innovators we spoke to, on the one hand, tell us how important it is to have flexibility in developing new products and services, and we certainly agree with that. But at the same time, they want increased certainty to understand what they can and can't do. So those are kind of the three challenges that we see in the online privacy environment today. Let me just say a little bit more about each one. I think that as the internet has moved over the last 15 years from being what my colleague Karen Kornbluth, who's the ambassador to the OECD, says, as the internet has moved from being the sideshow to the main show in our marketplaces, I think that we've had a sense that personal information needs some kind of baseline privacy protection. People don't want to feel that they're just out there completely unprotected, and that's understandable. In the mid-90s, there was, I think, very good reason to take very cautious, careful steps, that not wanting to overregulate, not wanting to over-prescribe the rules. And I think that approach had a lot of merit and still does in many ways today. But the fact that consumers are asking for a greater sense of certainty shouldn't come as a surprise to any of us. And I think what makes it hard to make progress in that direction, however, is that we have a number of questions that are difficult to answer. If we think there should be some baseline privacy protection, what's going to be the source of the rules? Are we just going to legislate a set of rules? Are we going to have legislation which would then also give some sort of regulatory authority to our colleagues at the FTC or somewhere else? Should we create a privacy protection, a data protection authority the way that our European allies have and many other trade partners have? Or should we rely more on the voluntary enforceable codes of conduct that the FTC has had a huge role in encouraging and enforcing? It's a wide range of choices, and I think that we're still in the process of trying to understand what's working, what's not, and how we would move. And then related to that, what should be the enforcement venue? I think that the FTC is a premier consumer protection agency around the world, as Tim may be able to attest. We certainly talk to lots of U.S. companies who say they're more worried about what the FTC thinks about them than any data protection authority, notwithstanding the fact that the FTC doesn't actually have formal privacy protection authority, explicitly. And then as Tom noted, obviously in setting out any kind of a baseline privacy framework, we want to find some sense of balance between the need to protect consumers and the need to encourage innovation. The second paradox that we see very, very strongly is that the popular perception of U.S. law, both amongst consumers in the U.S. And amongst the data protection authorities around the world, is that the U.S. privacy framework is inadequate. And I'd say that we've spent the last year looking carefully at that question. We think that the U.S., in contrast to that, has quite robust privacy protection. We have a robust set of sectoral privacy rules. We have common law privacy protection that kicks in certain places. We have very strong constitutional privacy protection against the government intrusion on individual privacy that often actually informs the way we think about consumer privacy issues as well, such as some of the do not call litigation that's going on. There seems to be a sense that there's some gap in the U.S. framework. I think that if you look at the work principally that's been done, encouraged by the Federal Trade Commission, that the leading edges of the internet economy, of the services offered in the internet, particularly in the online advertising environment, have really put in a huge amount of effort and made substantial commitments on voluntary codes of conduct that the FTC then goes on to enforce through its Section 5 jurisdiction. I think one of the key questions we face is, does that model scale up in any way? Can we spread? We think that model has a lot of advantages in the internet environment. It's probably faster and more responsive than a traditional rulemaking framework would be. But it also has left a number of gaps that we're well aware of. There are many sectors in the online economy that don't have these rules and best practices in place. The question is, what do we do with those? I think that the challenge there really is that we face a global environment in which obviously the U.S. and a number of our trading partners have different regulatory structures overall, whether you want to ascribe the difference between a common law and a civil law environment, or different cultural attitudes about privacy protection. Clearly, there are very different approaches to privacy protection. I think our challenge, as we really are now full scale in this really global internet economy, is to figure out how to begin to bridge some of the gaps between the U.S. framework and the data protection framework, which is spread to a number of other countries around the world. I myself personally give relatively low odds that we'll have any kind of a grand global privacy protection treaty anytime soon. So I think the challenge is really going to be to find ways, practical ways to bridge those gaps. As we do, I would point out, in many other commercial law environments, in many other trade law environments, in many other criminal law and many other regulatory environments, we recognize that different countries have different rules. We express our rules differently, but still we find ways to facilitate global trade in goods and services and global interactions of individual citizens all around the world. That's really the key challenge we're going to have to face. Finally, innovators who we hear from, on the one hand, clearly need flexibility to be able to develop new products and services, don't want to have to wait for regulatory approval for a new service, ought not to have to wait for regulatory approval for a new service, ought not to have to wait for new rules to be developed in the social networking context or the location services context or any number of other areas where we see innovation related to personal information. But by the same token, those innovators want certainty about what they can and can't do and should and shouldn't do. And they also want to have a way to reach a kind of a meeting of the minds with their customers about how to offer services that are comfortable for those customers. Again, I think that the process that has gone on is really in a multi-stakeholder style between the FTC and a number of the industries, particularly the online advertising industry, I think ought to be a model for other industries, for other sectors in the online economy, to develop codes of conduct that can then, in some way or another, be enforceable and that can give consumers real confidence. I think anyone in this room who's been involved in those kinds of efforts to reach voluntary agreements knows that it's probably almost as hard to do that as to reach agreements on actually legislated rules. And I'll just close by saying I think that the challenge that we all face is to figure out how to move that process forward. I think it offers a lot of advantages in the internet environment, and we all ought to be looking very carefully at how to make progress there, both domestically and also how to encourage our allies, other countries around the world, in that same direction. So I look forward to your questions, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Danny. Mark?
Well, Danny just spoke more eloquently about the FTC than I will in my experience, but obviously we have coordinated closely with Commerce on various privacy issues as they go forward with their process and as we move forward with our roundtable process. This would be a really good time to announce the roundtable rules, but not rules, but anyway, I'm not going to do that today. I know there are a lot of people anticipating sort of the report and what the report on the roundtables might say, but let me just go back in time a little bit and say that on behavioral targeting, this is an issue that we've been thinking about, obviously, for many years now, and held a workshop about 3 years ago where we got all experts in the field to come in and speak about this and gathered public comment on targeting, and sort of started a process that led to a series of guidelines that were announced in 2009, in the winter of 2009. And basically, those were proposals for that the self-regulatory system might contain in the FTC's viewpoint. And the purpose of that was to sort of jog thinking about what could be done by industry to sort of move things from where they had been at that point. There were a lot of concerns about the visibility of targeting, what consumers knew about it, and consumer autonomy. So, part of the concern was about consumer data falling into the wrong hands or being used for unanticipated purposes. So, I should preface my remarks here by saying everything I say today is just my own view, and doesn't bind the Commission or any of the commissioners. But you may be interested in somebody else's view who's a big dog, which is David Vladeck, and he was interviewed recently on behavioral targeting, and talked about sort of the harm of targeting, and said basically that he doesn't think that delivery of targeted ads is the principal concern. That some people obviously are concerned about that, but it's more about this aggregation of data that is used for targeting, and sort of how that information is used, and particularly tracking around sensitive issues. My wife and I have been fortunate to have 2 kids in the last several years, and each child was greeted by the arrival of baby formula in the mail to us, and you're wondering, okay, well, who in the world knows that we are having a baby, and how did they find out, and all this kind of stuff. And obviously that's raised concerns from some people who ended up not really making it through the pregnancy for whatever reason, a miscarriage or what have you. It can be devastating in that kind of a situation to be reminded of that as you move forward. The Wall Street Journal obviously has had a great series of articles on privacy in recent months, and raised the spectrum of targeting around issues like people with bipolar diseases and so forth. And obviously, even in that field, it could be a great thing to target somebody for new medications or what have you. But there's also that concern about the privacy implications of that. So the staff report that we ultimately issued in February and sort of accepted public comment on, and then issued a revised report later in 2009, there were 3 main principles that were proposed. One was consumers should be told that their information is being collected for behavioral advertising. They should have some kind of choice about that, and they should have an easy way to exercise that choice. So the report specifically acknowledged, and nobody at the Commission disputes by any means, the benefits of behavioral targeting. I think there are benefits both for companies in the form of increased revenue. I think that those benefits don't necessarily accrue to all companies equally. I think it's possible that behavioral targeting may actually not benefit some companies in the space, depending on who they are and where they are. But definitely, we've acknowledged that that there's increased revenue there, and also that this is good for a lot of consumers in the sense that they can see ads that they're more interested in, and a lot of people are more interested in seeing ads that they're interested in and seeing a lot of ads that they're not. So that process did result in the launching of the self-regulatory proposal by a number of trade associations, and the development of tools, a variety of tools by other individual companies to give consumers more control over the collection and use of their data. There have also been some consumer education efforts that have come out of that. So, the IAB and NAI and DMA and others are working around this consistent icon that would be displayed and used, and sort of would alert people in the ads that behavioral targeting is being conducted, and give people an opportunity to learn more about that and exercise some choice around that. In addition, some major companies like Google and Microsoft and Yahoo have been allowing people an interface where they can adjust, find out what information sort of is known about them and adjust those preferences. I think one interesting fact for this debate is that the feedback that those companies have reported, I don't know that there have been individual statistics or percentages given, but what we've heard is that relatively few consumers who have gone to learn about their preferences and exercise their preferences have actually fully opted out of that process. Instead, they have seeing what information, what categories they're put in, and either left them as they were or tweaked them, but not completely opted out of that system. I think, the one question that we have about these systems, even though it's great that they've been introduced, that there are a variety of systems. There's more than one self-regulatory system out there. There's a lot of companies that have individual systems out there. And so just, is that going to be manageable by the consumer who's looking to exercise control over their information? Going to all these different places and knowing where to go and knowing, what that, where their preferences need to be expressed and to what extent those are going to be respected, whether for individual companies or across the marketplace. So with that, I'll stop talking and be happy to answer questions as well.
Thank you to ITIF and to TDI for the kind invitation. Today I'm going to talk as Tim and not as Facebook, so that allows me to do, I think, a little bit more forward-looking stuff rather than give you sort of rote talking points that any company representative can give you at any time. I think that allows me to look a little bit further into the future, I hope, as well. In doing so, I do share the three values that I think Facebook thinks about when we're dealing with any new product innovation, when we're thinking about the marketplace, when we're thinking about online privacy. And those are freedom, ownership, and control. It should be the case, I think, that people anywhere should be free to share what they want. They should be free to speak their minds, and they should be able to do it for free. Ownership. It should be the case that any information you put online is yours. You should keep it, you should have it, you should be able to do with it as you wish. It should remain in your control as a consumer. And it seems again to me that part and parcel of having ownership is that control factor as well. You should be able to share exactly what you want, with whom you want, when you want, and only at those times. And so all of those things sort of inform the way that I think about online privacy. I think they typify the way that most people at Facebook think about online privacy. And I hope you'll keep them in mind as the rest of my remarks sort of roll out. It's increasingly the case that life online is essentially a social construct. It is no longer an isolated activity. And I think that's fairly obvious, although a good truism to keep in mind. We have the fact that with Facebook, you have over 500 million people actively sharing every single month. We have 700,000 plus applications, which are all social in nature, which have been built on our platform and are actively working right now. But it's not just Facebook. There are dozens of social networks around the world, competitors of ours, and they are operating and dominant in a number of marketplaces. And they look very different than Facebook, but they all have that same overlay of being a social construct. And I think that really does change the way we all, as individuals and as consumers, interact with the internet. Looking forward, I see that the future of online privacy is going to be dictated by four variables and a corollary, a fifth that comes directly from those four variables. And so again, this is Tim talking here, but this is how I think, this is the direction I think we're heading in, generally as a society. One, I think we can imagine, and I'll return to these, increasing speed in the future. Two, increasing accessibility. Three, increasing mobility. And four, increasing personalization, which leads, I think, to a corollary of a necessity for increased personal responsibility to go along with the responsibilities borne by government and by companies. So let me return to the first, because I think it's important to start there. And I should say, with these four variables, and this is going to be a broad point for you all to take away, each consumer is going to think about these four variables in a different way. They're going to value them in a different way. Some people are going to prefer speed to portability. Some people are going to prefer personalization to increase speed, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that says something about what, if any, regulatory or legal structure should be laid on top of the existing internet system. because consumers will demand these variables and in different orders, I think it should direct governments, and it should mitigate towards flexibility in governmental structures rather than rigidity. Because all of this, you should take away, is consumer demand driven. It's not as if companies are dreaming up demands. I think these are really driven by what people increasingly want. And therefore, companies are fitting their products into those niches. So let me talk a little bit about increasing speed. This should not be a surprise to anyone. The US is, by some accounts, fallen well behind the rest of the world in terms of the speed with which we allow transmissions, uploads, downloads. Don't need to spend a lot of time there, but you all know that people, all of you, when you encounter the internet, want things to happen faster. You don't want to wait for the page upload. You don't want to hear the modem ringing in the background. It seems so long ago to talk about that, but really, for some people, that's still how they encounter the internet. I was in Morocco just 2 weeks ago, and I was astounded to hear the sound of modems in the background, and I think that was really not so very long ago for all of us, that's how many of us were interacting with the internet. So increasing speed is a demand for consumers. Increasing accessibility. It seems that every one of us now want to have ubiquitous access to the internet. We were lucky, I think, just a few short years ago to get it on our desktops at work. We were then lucky to have it in our laptops. We're increasingly lucky to have it on our mobile phones, but we all as consumers seem to want access to the internet everywhere. And I think there's a blizzard of products that are fitting that need. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that we all want to be tethered or connected, or at least have the ability. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Speaking about being tethered or connected, I apologize.
You really want it? Because you want it that bad?
I really, yeah, sometimes I want to walk away, but I want to have the choice as a consumer, right? And I think that's important, but we want to at least be able to, when we want to reach out, have access to it. Next point, I think increased mobility is a necessity. Most of us now don't tend to encounter the internet primarily through a fixed computer and a desktop, and that's the only place we get it. We want to have it with us wherever we are, whether we're traveling in Morocco, on the train going up to New York, we want to have it on the metro, driving in traffic, walking, going to a restaurant, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that really is something that consumers have come to demand and value. But that means that we're not in a place where there's a one-set security protocol or privacy protocol about how we are going to interact with the internet. We may be using other people's computers. We may be using other people's devices. And so the privacy regimes that we might want as consumers should hopefully follow us, just as we are increasingly mobile in a society and the internet becomes increasingly mobile. I think the fourth point here is an important one. I see the future of the internet less as a static set of interactions where all of us get the same content every time we go to a website. I think the future looks more like when we go to websites, we have content that is personalized for each of us. It addresses our needs directly. It is customized, individualized, whatever term you want to use, which means when you go to the Washington Post site, there should be a set of clips designed by your friends and colleagues, people whom you trust, ready there waiting for you to say, these are the stories that I think you should read first. So you don't have to flip through all the 57 pages of the paper. You shouldn't have to go to a music site and try to cut through the wide swath of music that you could be encountering. You should have things which are directed to you by people you know that can help you out. Of course, from that we should expect increased efficiency. Right? It should be more efficient to go on the internet. We should get the information we want faster because it's the information directed to us and it's individualized. Some people have written about this in a negative tone, that if you go to an internet site and it has some information about you, and it gives you some sort of individualized or personalized experience, that's a negative. It's likely to increase the privacy risk. And I think it's actually the opposite. I think it turns the consumer business position on its head. And I think it puts the consumer in control of that relationship. I think it gives consumers information which is directed to them, which gives them a more bargaining control, which gives them more information about what their friends experiences were with a particular business, what quality demands they should make, what price they should demand, particularly when we're not talking about fixed sets of goods. So I think of increased personalization as an enormous consumer benefit that's coming. I hope we'll be a part of it at Facebook. But again, these are just me talking. This leads to a strange fifth corollary, increased personal responsibility. Because consumers will be demanding, and are demanding these four variables in their lives and in their products that they encounter, it seems to me that governments cannot play a role of setting one rigid regime. Because again, as I say, each of us is going to have a different order evaluation for these goods, these increased desires. It also means that companies, which are trying to give flexibility and meet these demands, may not be able to impose one system which is universally acceptable to all of their consumers. Again, we as companies need to be responsive to these demands. But I think that means then that we're going to have to teach consumers to take advantage of the innovation that's occurring in privacy tool building. I think that as companies, Yahoo, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, others, Time Warner, begin to give consumers tools to control information online, that consumers are going to need to be either trained, acclimatized, and in some cases expected to interact with these tools so that they can begin to have as much freedom, ownership, and control as they desire. So let me stop there and just say this is, again, Tim talking, but I think this is where we're heading. I think we should all keep this in mind when we're thinking about online privacy in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
It's working. That was good. You should associate those remarks with Facebook. Anything I say that is intelligent is Time Warner Cable speaking, and anything I say that's controversial is just me. I also want to thank ITIF and TPI for putting this panel together. This is an important topic, and I appreciate the framing of it in terms of innovation. And I want to take a step back and talk about that a little bit. I think we all agree about the importance of advertising to markets and how it's supported growth in terms of video content, applications, technology, services, and the like. To get the benefits to continue to expand, to have continued American leadership in these markets, the advertising marketplace itself needs to evolve. And why is that so? That's so because it doesn't take much to realize that, just taking content, for example, continuing to fund creative, inventive content, entertainment, news, information, services, and the like, is going to require more and more resources. In order for those resources to be present, business models are going to have to continue to evolve to provide funding streams. And an innovative and open marketplace is essential to providing ongoing, growing funding for the kind of things that consumers expect, desire online. And when we talk about online, it's hard not to comment a little bit about what's been said. I think it's important not to put a box around a technology, a service, or in particular to say something is internet, something is not. For purposes of this discussion, I'd like to just talk about the innovation and the fact that platforms evolve and technology converges. And so I think we want to, in this environment, think about the importance of protecting and encouraging American innovation. From the perspective of a broadband service provider, a cable company like Time Warner Cable, I think we have a lot to offer in terms of news, information, entertainment services. The history of cable television, just to take an example, in creating a hybrid subscription advertising television product marketplace, to me is a powerful example of innovation in business models and the virtue of competition by new entrants in content distribution. That's what allowed consumers to go from 3 or 4 free over-the-air television channels to 50, 200, and so on, television and other forms of nonlinear video programming. So competition, I think, is important, and entry is important. And fostering innovation is important, and that is, I think, a very key theme. To support entry and innovation, I think we have to recognize that privacy rules determine who gets to participate in the marketplace and under what conditions. The benefits of having entry into advertising, and we're talking not just about putting interstitial ads into a web page. I think we're talking about things that involve video and the internet and mobile and all kinds of other services that could be supported by business models that are both subscription, advertising, somewhere in the middle. I think it's important to think about how that's the future of expanded output for the American economy and for American leadership in terms of the new content and services that consumers want and expect. And it's also important to remember that despite the tremendous growth of online advertising, what we're talking about in terms of online behavioral advertising or targeted advertising, the online advertising business itself is still small relative to advertising writ large, and relative to the importance of advertising and other business models writ large in the economy. So if we want to continue to grow the overall supply of products, services, content, applications, and everything that our customers and everyone else's customers, consumers, constituents are enjoying, I think we have to be thoughtful about the fact that when you have certainty, a lot of times what you have are boundaries. And boundaries can become barriers. So it's important to think, as Tom has pointed out, about the costs and benefits of boundaries and barriers. And I think it's important to think about entry as a company that does a lot of advertising in terms of television. And currently we don't have a business advertising online. To me, what's important is thinking about the future and how we're going to grow the value of what we're providing to customers. Privacy rules for an evolving marketplace, I think the Commerce Department, our NTIA put it well when they said they need to align flexibility for innovators along with privacy protection. Protecting consumer privacy is very important to us. Our customers' relationship with us depends on their trust in what we provide them. And in fact, from what they tell us, they trust us a great deal. And part of that is because they have an ongoing relationship with us. They know who they can call when they have a problem. And we hear from them. So we take it very seriously, and we take that obligation to protect their security, to protect their online safety very seriously. In that framework and in that context, though, I think it's also important to remember that as we talk about rules for the future, we talk about legislation, we talk about a framework for ensuring American competitiveness, that those rules are crafted in a way that promote innovation by protecting the ability to innovate, to enter into marketplaces, and to provide consumers with the benefit of new services and products.
Thanks, Fernando. So we have about 30 minutes left. I do want us to get into a little bit of a conversation here. And I do want to give everyone a chance, audience, to comment or ask a question. But first, I want the panelists, which comments that they made, or something you want to respond to someone else. Why don't we take a few minutes to go back through and just have a little bit of a dialogue here. I'll start off. There were three issues, there were 3 points made that I'd like to highlight or dig a little bit more into. One point that Tim was making was about how privacy is really valuable on many things that people have different, they choose different things, some people want abilities and speed. And I think when we talk about technology and the internet more broadly, it's always about choice. It's about giving consumers choice. I think one of the problems with a lot of the privacy proposals that we've seen so far is that they're about imposing a single view of privacy on all internet users. And so as we think about options here, I think the idea of creating flexible regulation, flexible proposals comes up again, but how do you do that? How do you create a model that allows choice? I think that's a key issue here. Danny had mentioned that consumers, or surveys are showing that consumers are more and more worried about privacy. And I think that's probably due to two things. One, we've seen over the last decade or so, there's a pretty strong privacy lobby group out there that are telling consumers. So I don't think it's too surprising that 10 years later they started agreeing because they've heard it so much. But I think the other issue here, and again, I can hit on this, is that for a lot of consumers, it's an issue of certainty or uncertainty. It's about understanding what's going on. And if you fix the certainty issue, that does fix some of the unresolved questions about privacy. And lastly, I just wanted to hit on, Mark mentioned the Wall Street Journal articles on privacy that have come out. And the examples that you talked about there, for example, pregnancies or illnesses. To me, when I heard those examples, that's a data failure problem. These companies didn't have the right data, so they made a mistake. They either gave a bad advertisement, or they didn't use that data for something more effective on the problem. So I think when we start talking about that example, as I said at the beginning, I think what we really should be focusing on is innovation in this space and how we can do things better. And that's a perfect example of how there are problems you can see, but there's also a lot of opportunities. We should be talking about the opportunities as much as we talk about the problems. And I'll just open it up so anyone is welcome.
So I think we ought to take the opportunity to be somewhat optimistic about the possibility of getting this right. And the reason is that I think we've actually gotten it right before in the history of US privacy rules. I think that it's ironically one of the first privacy laws that was passed in kind of the modern privacy era, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, is an example of a privacy law that Mark probably has a lot of experience with, that actually doesn't have the pitfall that Tom identified. The Fair Credit Reporting Act is not about restricting what information is collected. It's about making sure that it's used in a way that the information is used in a way that it's fair and accurate and ultimately non-discriminatory. And I think this was a really important insight back in the very early 70s, 1970s, that with the rise of at the time, these sort of gargantuan-seeming consumer credit bureaus, with at the time extraordinarily powerful data processing capability that was being brought to bear against people in the kind of perception of the time, that there was a very forward-looking and I think wise approach taken that said, let's really look carefully at what we're trying to accomplish with these services, and what the risks are to consumers, and how we can create an environment in which consumers will feel comfortable and protected without restricting what information is collected. And the key insight in the Fair Credit Reporting Act, many people don't like the Fair Credit Reporting Act when you talk about it because they only know about it when they get denied a loan. but I think it's an incredibly important aspect of the law, actually, is that it actually regulates the consumer credit environment in such a way that we're able to have a very robust consumer credit economy, and consumers only even have to know about it, have to pay attention to it when there's what's called an adverse consequence, when there's some decision that's taken against them, and then a whole series of rights kick in. So I think that we have the possibility of getting this right if we focus on which are the areas where consumers are not able to protect themselves through the kinds of tools that Tim talked about as an example. And how do we tune whatever the regulatory framework is going to be so that it works most efficiently? And just to say one more thing about the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is my kind of current new favorite old privacy law, it actually set out to try to encourage people to be willing to participate in this system. And it actually took the view that more information collection was better, because more information would, in theory, lead to more accurate credit scores. That would provide more people access to credit when they needed it. It created a whole marketplace that really didn't exist. And it did so by looking very carefully at where protection was needed and where recourse was needed for consumers. So I think we have the possibility of getting these things right.
Well, actually, what I would like to do is just maybe ask a question of the two government representatives. Because first, Danny, because you talked about international harmonization. So, for example, this recent study that suggests that the European privacy laws have had a fairly significant impact. Does that, and also the FTC presumably in its recommendations, even though they may be less concerned explicitly with that, they may be leaning in directions of getting closer to the European regime. So how would a study like that influence your thinking? Results like that.
Are you talking about thinking as to what the right U.S. framework is, or how to interact with Europe and to get global?
Either one, either or not.
Well, let me talk about the global environment. Look, I think there's no question that the online advertising environment is critical to the internet economy. Anyone who thinks otherwise isn't paying attention. And we take it as a given that it's an important contributor. I will say that we continue to be hopeful that the online advertising community stays up to date with the self-regulatory practices, and really in some ways the co-regulatory practices, these voluntary enforceable codes of conduct. It's work to keep those up to date. It's work to spread those around the marketplace. And I don't underestimate that. I think, as Mark said, a number of the participants in the online economy are stepping up and taking those measures, and I think that's to be commended. I think that Congress and many of our allies around the world are going to be looking at how much those practices really spread and how widely adopted they are. So that's something we all have to stay focused on. As to the global picture, that study seems to me, even though it comes from MIT, I haven't studied it carefully. But if you take its conclusions as reported, that's obviously a question that the European regulators have to face. We should not feel that there's a kind of a simplistic attitude at the European Commission or in the European Parliament. They're certainly very aware of the importance of encouraging innovation in their information industries. And I expect that, I know that they're paying careful attention to that. The question for them is not only about how to do privacy protection, but also about how to balance other innovation concerns in there. I think that
It's a concern for us if we're thinking of moving.
certainly, yes, it certainly would be if that's what we were thinking of. I would say that the challenge that we face, as a global community, is to really try to take a more careful look at where our privacy regimes are different and where they actually aren't. I think it's been notable to me over the last couple of years. You look at the investigations that the Federal Trade Commission does in the privacy arena, and the investigations that a number of the European data protection authorities are doing. And in some cases, they're investigating the same companies and the same practices. And I don't think this should be a surprise to us, number one, because it's a global environment and the practices spread. In some cases, we franchise them out. But more seriously, I think the fact that we have regulators all around the world investigating many of the same questionable practices, or at least allegedly questionable practices, suggests that we may actually have more in common in practice across these different regimes than we do at the formal level. As I said, we clearly express our views of privacy differently. You you can have hours and hours of discussion about that. But I think when it comes down to questions of basic consumer fairness and basic consumer protection, we're probably a whole lot closer. And I think that the FTC has done a lot of good work in trying to find cooperation with regulators in Canada, with regulators in other parts of Europe. And my feeling is that's really going to be hopefully our way forward to work on practical ways to lower the barriers and find what I would call interoperability of regulatory regimes more so than harmonization. Harmonization requires a kind of a top-down agreement on terms and all kinds of other things, whereas I think we can get towards interoperability by taking a series of practical steps.
Well, I don't have a lot to say except that I agree with your general argument in your opening that the more research that's done along the lines of the European study, the better. We actually had Professor Tucker come to visit the FTC this week, and she made a presentation. We have a wonderful series of BE seminars our Bureau of Economics holds. And there's one interesting result from the paper, which I also haven't made my way through, aside from printing it. That's the extent so far. But she did indicate that they had looked at the effectiveness of advertising on Europeans coming to American websites as well. And they found that as to those Europeans, the ads were equally effective as for American consumers. So that's a little bit of a surprising result. If, as she said was the case, Europeans are, as you might expect, surfing more on European websites than American websites. So there would be a lot less information about them available to the American marketers. So I think there's, it's a very interesting study. I think sort of how it all plays out ultimately is a little bit unclear still.
I was struck by both, Andy, your suggestion or the reference to what consumers want and what customers want. It seems to me that that's really important. It's important to us to get it right, obviously, as a business. I think it's really important in policy to understand it, and I'm happy to hear about the FTC's interest in research, and I'm happy to hear. I know that you are reading studies, and I feel like I should do a plug here because I'm looking for work in this area from people as well. I'm looking for people to come and talk to us about research they're doing, and I'm also interested in talking about what our customers are telling us, because I think that's something that especially the expert agencies need to hear about as well, because one of the things that surprises me is what customers care about. They care about not being confused. They care about finding things that they want, getting things they want, being treated fairly. I guess you can put in front of them ideas that make them worried. That's, to me, is less interesting than what is it that they really care about. And so when we talk about consumers and consumers being worried, I think the research is really important. I think real data is important. And the more of it, the more helpful. The more studies that are done, the better for policy. I would think you agree with that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I can report one piece of data that we've collected at the Commerce Department. We've restarted an effort that was begun in the 90s with the Census Bureau. There were annual surveys of internet usage around the country. These were what were known in the 90s as the digital divide surveys. We've started them up again, and in particular trying to look at what drives household use of internet services. And obviously, so one of the things we've tried very hard to look at is if a household does not have internet access, why don't they have internet access? And there are all kinds of reasons. Some households say they're not interested. Many say they can't. Many who don't have internet access home say that it's because it's not affordable. Obviously, if you live in a rural area, it's harder to get internet access in many cases. Interestingly, of the quote main reasons why households don't adopt internet access, privacy and security was way down at about 2% of the survey. Now it's not. Now it may still be a concern, but I do think it puts in perspective to some extent how people are feeling about the online environment. I think that all you have to do is look at the growth of the environment. You could say, well, people as a whole, the country as a whole, is obviously not in a state of moral panic because of the kind of growth of the services that we've seen. And I do think it's important to keep that in perspective.
Thanks. I want to go ahead and open it up. We have a mic in the back, so just raise your hand.
Yes. Okay.
Just say your name.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Hi, my name is Ted Gotch, and I'm with Telecommunications Reports. And I have admittedly somewhat of a tangential privacy question to this, but as many of you might have seen today, there were media reports about the Obama administration wanting to beef up legislation to allow for wiretapping on the internet possibly for next year. I wanted to see if anyone up there was interested in sharing their comments or thoughts on that idea.
Any takers of it? I guess I should have prefaced this, but why don't we try and focus comments on the discussion we've already had? I think that's what most people up here would prefer to do at this moment, but I'm sure we really did not get into a whole set of government privacy issues, and those are a whole separate panel. I'm sure some of us have a talk to people about.
Thanks, Ken. I'm Baron Sok at the Progress and Freedom Foundation. I'm Baron Sok. I just wanted to ask, it seems like a lot of the conversation here is really depending on the issue of how easy it is for consumers to control their privacy and the use of their data. So I just want to hear what everyone's vision is for how we get to a world in privacy such as what we have now for online parental controls and filters, wherein basically parents can make pretty effective decisions about the content that their children get to consume. So similarly here, how do we move from a current world where you have somewhat fractured controls that are typically on a site-by-site basis to a world where there are more useful, interoperable privacy controls that will work for multiple sites and multiple services. So someone talked about interoperability. I'd just like to hear, again, what the vision is and how you see industry moving forward on that.
So that's a great question, and it's exactly the kind of sort of innovating and product development and design development effort that is important for industry to participate in and for us to take a lead on. And I think there's a lot of work that we have ahead of us. Now, having said that, I think that we, certainly as a company and the cable industry as an industry, there's a record of both introducing services, finding that there's sort of a customer perception about how easy and useful services are, and needing to adjust to that to make services simpler and easier for customers to use. In fact, that's our mission as a company. So I think the same way that we talk about things like making it easier to record video content and making it possible for you to do home security monitoring in a way that is very simple, that is intuitive, and that gives customers control, the same type of approach has to be taken to online security and privacy to give customers comfort in what they're getting. And I think that there's great work that's been done by web publishers and companies like Facebook, and I say that as a happy Facebook user and father of Facebook users. But more can be done, and getting feedback from customers is really essential to that. But it's a process that we're just starting to figure out, and we've done some good work in it, and more work has to be done.
It's a great question, Baron. I think this whole marketplace is really in its infancy in terms of building tools for privacy control. Facebook explicitly, I think, says this, but I think explicitly people think about us competing internally on privacy controls and building new innovative tools. We think of it as a way that we distinguished ourselves from other social networks that were in the marketplace, that are still in the marketplace, but in some ways we have surpassed, because we explicitly decided that this was a good or a service that we were going to compete on, to the benefit of consumers. That's point number one. Point number two, I think the government actually has a role to play here in fostering innovative privacy tools. It should not be the case that when companies try to innovate and build a new privacy tool that has never before been dreamt up, that the first thing the government does is jump on you and say, you didn't get it exactly the right way the first time. I think there should be explicitly government flexibility and understanding when the main thrust of the tool is there for consumer benefit and to build into consumer hands freedom, ownership, and control. If we do that, I think we'll actually see the marketplace move en masse towards these tools, and then you'll begin to see interoperability as more companies embrace the promises that are possible with new privacy controls.
Michael Calabrese from New America Foundation. So, yeah, I guess maybe following on that, I generally lean toward favoring tools, not rules, particularly when you're looking at the collection and flow of information. Yeah. At the same time, and I think it's been mentioned already, there are going to be abuses and harms that will necessitate certain enforceable rules of the road. And so, I want to ask, I guess, for the others to comment on what Danny mentioned as another possible framework on that side of the equation, which is, Danny mentioned, in fact, people should look up more than just off the top of his head. He wrote an excellent paper 2 or 3 years ago saying that the Fair Credit Reporting Act might be a possible framework with the idea that you actually encourage more collection and flow of information, but you regulate its use. You regulate. What can it be used for? And this would be, I would think, particularly with respect to sensitive information, important. So I'm just wondering, maybe Danny could say a bit more about that, but I'm particularly interested in, how the others. Is that a promising framework because it gets at the use of the data rather than its collection and rather than limiting its collection and flow?
Well, I think, thanks, Michael, for the plug. That was a paper that was written when I was at MIT, so it's not a government position. But I think it actually closely connects to what Fernando and Tim were talking about. The challenge, I think, for these privacy tools as a design matter and for the notion of user control as a policy matter in the privacy space is to figure out how to get on the right side of the transparency equation. I mean, we have all the issues we have here because of increased transparency, and that's just descriptively true, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing or a harmful thing or whatever else. So it doesn't matter at this point. We do live in a more transparent environment, and I would suggest that's brought obviously tremendous benefits. But I think the challenge is to use that transparency to help increase consumer sense of confidence and increase accountability so that when there are abuses, it's possible to detect them, but not to worry at every step along the way that there might be some abuse. Because that imposes regulatory burdens on the one hand on companies, and it puts consumers in what is an increasingly kind of incoherent and just anxiety-producing situation. If you're presented with choice after choice after choice after choice, you start to worry about whether you've made the right choices. And I think our goal should be to use the transparency that we have, to use the tremendous analytic and processing resources that are now virtually free, so that consumers can get a greater sense of confidence. I'll just make one observation as a kind of a sense of direction. In the in the amendments to HIPAA, to the health privacy rules that were included as part of the Electronic Medical Records Stimulus Act, Dan knows a lot about this, there was actually a right that was given to consumers, to patients that is, that if your record was in an electronic medical record system and it was transferred to some other system, you had a right to access the audit trail. And the idea of that was to enable the creation of services that would help consumers to figure out where their medical information was going and where it wasn't going, and whether they felt comfortable with what was happening, and ultimately whether all the relevant rules were being followed. And I think that kind of direction that builds on the transparency capabilities that we have in the online environment is the right direction to go.
Well, I mean, one thing to think about is the type of information that is collected for credit purposes and under the Fair Credit Reporting Act is non-anonymous information. So the type of information that we're talking about in terms of online advertising is generally anonymous information. So obviously it's much easier to think about sensible rules about how non-anonymous information of the type that's in people's credit reports, should be used and should not be used than the reams of information, the reams of anonymous information that are collected, on the basis of people's browsing behavior. I don't even know how one would be able to think about developing rules about what uses would be permissible and what uses would not be permissible.
Can I follow up? Yeah. Sure. We're going to have to wrap up in a minute, but one would be quick.
Well, just to make a quick comment, I think people have different levels of concern about privacy, and they have different things that they're concerned about. But for many people, like especially in the mobile space, where you're carrying around a phone and it's basically with you all the time, and my wife doesn't use my phone and so forth, it is more directed and collecting information from me as opposed to somebody else. And a lot of the concerns that people might have, don't really relate to whether personal information about me has been collected or not. I mean, if I'm concerned about being targeted because I'm bipolar or because I am pregnant or what have you, if it's coming to the device, for some people, there's the harm right there.
I just want to make one quick note. There's a lot of ways that you could think of a new privacy regime with, as Danny said, baseline privacy standards. I've been kind of surprised that everyone's thinking about collection, and nobody's really thinking about the impact. And to me, the easiest privacy rule to the right would be, we forbid discriminatory uses of data, period. One line, one sentence, it changes the entire ways that companies think about data. It changes the relationship of consumers to businesses. And I think it would set the whole marketplace in a different direction, and probably a better direction. Facebook doesn't sell data. That's a very important choice that I'm proud of, something I've worked on. Lots of other companies do. There's a huge commodities marketplace in data. If you said you can sell data, but you can't discriminate with the information that you get from the sale, you'd have a totally different marketplace and a totally different set of results. I think it's an easy kind of practice to put in place, and very different than the ones that have been put up so far.
Well, this is obviously a conversation that could keep going for a while, but we are going to have to wrap it up. I did want to mention, we talked about this study from MIT University, if you're interested in it. We summarized it in the last ITIF 2000 back, with a reference to it. Please join me in thanking the panel.
Rob, how are you? Good. Good to see you. Good to see you. I guess, Charlie, how are you doing? Ready for a minute?
In New York. Didn't you just get back from somewhere? That's what I was thinking.
One of these days you're going to meeting yes.
Oh, yeah.